Okay, now I just want to speak briefly about this whole idea of inheritance, of legacy. Now, I didn't really, it's not something I thought about very much, until recently. And sometimes it's good to look back to your past and to reflect on people you met and situations that happened years ago, because it can be instructive. It can kind of teach you about what's happening today and why people feel the way they do. Now, one such story from my past, this is where I met a British couple. I was on a weekend away with a girl I was going out with at the time. We were staying in a place outside of Slane, country house there. And I'll never forget, like, this man that we met, this couple, the British couple, and the man, he was incredibly downbeat. He was incredibly glum and saddened, I would say, by the state of Southampton and what had become of his hometown. Just give me a moment here. Trying to do a bit of work as I'm making this video. But basically the situation was that he had seen his hometown of Southampton being transformed in front of his eyes over the space of a couple of decades, you could say. He hadn't voted for this change, but it had happened anyway. And he was just very, very down about the whole thing, And the thing is, I couldn't relate to him. In 2005, Ireland hadn't really seen massive waves of immigration at that time. We had seen the anchor babies, we'd seen a certain amount of EU immigration, but nothing major. Those treaties of Lisbon and Nice, they were being signed around that time, but they hadn't kicked in at that stage. We hadn't seen the first waves of Eastern European immigration into Ireland at that point. So I simply couldn't relate to him. I couldn't relate to what was happening. I felt sad for him. I felt sorry for him, but couldn't relate to him. Now, 20 years later, I know exactly what that man must have felt, because, not only is it totally anti-democratic what's happening, and any reasonable person could recognise it's wrong. It's just wrong what's going on, and what has gone on to Ireland and to Britain and to all our countries, across Western Europe, really, over the last few decades. But I think what it comes down to is, and why people like myself and that man and many of us feel a sense of, it hits you inside somewhere, There's something about what's happening that is extremely disturbing. Not just the fact that we didn't vote for it, but the fact that it is quite literally washing our legacy as Irish people down the drain, And that's what it comes down to: inheritance, legacy. Ireland is quite literally our inheritance as Irish people, It's not the inheritance of Polish people or other Eastern Europeans or Ukrainians, or Indians or Chinese or Africans or Brazilians. Their countries, their home countries, is their legacy, it's their inheritance. But Ireland is our inheritance. And that is quite literally being taken away from us over the last few decades, but especially over the last few years. Okay? And that, I think, is why it strikes something deep inside a person, at least people who are alert, awake, aware of what's happening, It's something deeply kind of disturbing. And on the one hand, it's hard to get your head around it, but on the other hand, there is a certain sense of powerlessness, and that's exactly what that man felt, because we realize we can only enact change to a certain degree in regards to this. There are these protests with the IPAS centres. There are a certain amount of councillors voted in who were against these massive flows of immigration into Ireland. But for the most part, the establishment, the political parties, and even most of the councillors are, at the very least, indifferent to what's happening, if not indeed in favour of it. And that's a deeply disturbing and unsettling realisation, And this is what we are faced with. This is what we're dealing with, Like, we really need to protect that legacy which has been handed down to us. People who came through the famine, people who came through 1916 and the struggle for Irish independence, for Irish freedom. some of our direct relations were involved in that. My grandparents, on one side, were involved in the fight for Irish freedom. My grandmother was part of Cumann na Món, and her house was literally burned down by the Black and Tans. Like, this is how real it is to my family lineage. And this is why I guess I care about it more, we'll say, than the average person. But still, it shouldn't be just people like myself who had direct relations involved in the fight for Irish freedom. It should be the average ordinary Irish person. But it is a case of trying to reach those people and trying to get them to realise that, once this is gone, it's gone. Once Ireland gets to a certain point in terms of the numbers coming in terms of the numbers that are non-Irish, as a percentage of the overall population, which is 20, 21, 22% at this point, and only increasing with each year, you will get to a point where it will be unstoppable and where you won't be able to prevent things getting any worse. Like, Ireland should be predominantly Irish. It should be, of course it should. Every country deserves that. Every country deserves sovereignty for its own people. Ireland has lost that, and that's what, to me, is the most upsetting factor in all of this. And this is what that man in England, or that English man I met in Slane years ago, and this is what he felt as well. And this is why it's so important that we don't allow our own inheritance, our own legacy as Irish people, to be disregarded, to be thrown under the bus, because this is exactly what's happening at the moment, and we have to do all we can to put a stop to this